Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, a first look at what is on the front pages as they arrive. Well, in the next half an hour, we'll see what is making the headlines. That's with Katy Balls, Deputy Political Editor at The Spectator, and Ian Dunt, columnist at The Eye newspaper. So let's have a look what is on some of those front pages. Well, the Prime Minister has deployed troops, gunships and missile systems to Estonia and Poland to send a clear message to the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, that any threats over Ukraine will not be tolerated. That is on the front of the Express. And the government has been accused of trying to exploit an announcement over extra funding for poorer areas in England in a bid to save Boris Johnson's job. That is according to The Observer. And the Telegraph reports that there are calls for an overhaul of the culture at Number 10 and reveals the Prime Minister's most senior aide enjoyed hospitality at Lord's Cricket Ground a few days before the Taliban took control of Afghanistan. Now, the planned £12 billion hike in national insurance will go ahead, that's according to the Sunday Times, despite Tory backbenchers demanding it be scrapped. And the Sunday Mail reports on the harsh reality of the cost of living crisis. The paper speaks to a mother who says that she is being pushed into poverty. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you can see on your screen right now, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you also watch us. Well, we're joined, as I was saying, tonight by Katy Balls, Deputy Political Editor at The Spectator, and Ian Dunt, columnist at The Eye newspaper. Really good to see both of you tonight. Thank you for spending Saturday evening with us here on Sky News. We want to start by talking about the front page of the Sunday Express, Katy. PM's defiant message to hostile Putin.
Yes, and this is the announcement overnight that Britain is planning to actually double the number of troops in Estonia, where it already has, as tensions escalate over the situation with Ukraine and Russia. And now there's been talk for months, particularly though in recent weeks, that Russia could be imminent, really, in planning to enter Ukraine. You have Joe Biden, the American president, telling the Ukrainian president to expect an attack in the next few weeks. And I think this is the clear sign from many of the Western allies and NATO to say, really think about this to Putin and to suggest that if they do proceed, if Russia does do this, there will be consequences.
Yeah, and Ian, it's also featuring on the front of the Sunday Telegraph as well, with an image there of the Prime Minister being briefed by Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, the Chief of the Defence Staff there.
Yeah, but I mean, there is no possible consequence that would follow from this that would in any way alarm Putin or even make him think twice or even hesitate. The amount of troops and battalions that Putin has amassed on the Ukrainian border, I mean, he essentially has the military capacity to do whatever he wants. He can occupy, he can install puppet governments, he can take the West as well as the East. There is really no limitation on what he can do. And us sending another 900 troops to Estonia, which of course is not the same as Ukraine, would do absolutely nothing to make him think twice about this course of action. I think really when you look at it, and incidentally, also when you remember the things that the British government is not doing about Putin's aggression, for instance, the economic crimes bill that has sat moribund, which would make it much harder for Russian oligarch money to find its way into London. When you look at it as a whole, you think, well, this is at best ineffectual and at worst an attempt to distract from his domestic concerns.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about, Katy. I mean, all the while we've got a front page devoted entirely to this deployment of troops there and the PM getting involved in this escalating tension between Russia and Ukraine. You're not getting front pages devoted to the probe into parties.
Yeah, I mean, I think on that, I think it's probably a bit more nuanced than, either, for the Prime Minister's just doing this to not have to talk about parties, and vice versa. It's completely, benevolent of the Prime Minister to be interested in this issue and of no self-serving calls to him. I think clearly Boris Johnson's team would rather there be pictures out, not to do with Partygate, but of the Prime Minister acting acting tough and talking to his advisors on this issue. And I think that they'd rather people be talking about Ukraine, but it's also a very serious situation. And I agree with Ian to a degree in the sense that are obviously very limited things that the UK can do if it's not really planning to, enter efforts in war. But we're talking about some sanctions which could be effective, but also I think sending a signal that NATO is not going to listen to Putin's initial demand, which was that you had a decreased NATO presence in this area, if anything, going against them, with putting troops there. So I think there's a bit of both going on, but I think the situation in Ukraine and Russia is happening, even if there is still an ongoing row about parties, which is damaging to the Prime Minister, but also isn't the only story in town.
Yeah, what do you think, Ian? I mean, nobody denies the seriousness of what is happening on the Ukraine border there, but is this really a monumental dead cat strategy?
We've seen the tactic over the last week, 2 weeks, really. In fact, you could see Boris Johnson deploy it in the last PMQs, of just to point out or any other area of policy to get away from the main conversation which he does not want to have. And directly said to Keir Starmer, why won't you ask me about Ukraine? Jacob Rees-Mogg, one of his chief defenders at the moment, leader of the House of Commons, was retweeting Daily Mail headlines saying, haven't we lost proportion talking about parties rather than Ukraine? So I don't think we're being conspiratorial to suggest that they are desperate to talk about anything else. They've made it very clear that is their absolute strategy to pursue. The thing is, Ukraine is deadly serious. I mean, what is happening there is an absolutely abysmal affront to democratic values coming from a dictator and a tyrant trying to occupy an autonomous democratic state. Now, that is a terrible state of affairs to be in. And yet the problem lies with us, of course, because we have gotten ourselves into a situation where there is a prime minister so absurd that they would be in a scandal over parties during lockdown, rather than a position where they could legitimately and genuinely be paying attention to what is going on in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's easy to take your eye off the ball with the very many important things that are happening, not just here, but also in countries like Afghanistan and so on as well. Let's move on, Katy. Front page of the Sunday Times. Of course, there's been a lot of sort of internal row, hasn't there, about this proposed rise in national insurance, but it sounds like they've circled the wagons, and Prime Minister and Chancellor are both saying now that they are committed to pushing ahead with that £12 billion hike in national insurance.
Yes, and I think the reason that it is now a story that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor ultimately publicly saying that they still agree with government policy does relate to Partygate. We've had a situation where the Prime Minister has been in a very perilous position the past few weeks. Pressure from his party over what he knew over the Sue Gray report, which we still don't have out, and questions about a confidence vote. And one of the things that Boris Johnson and his supporters have been doing to try and shore up his position is to talk to MPs about what needs to change, other than the man himself, as far as they see it, in order to keep their support. And what they've kept hearing from MPs is to axe this national insurance rise, and they do not want a tax rise. The Chancellor has been pushing against this, suggesting it would be really irresponsible to ultimately axe a tax rise if you don't know what you're going to replace it with, given inflation. And it looks as though Boris Johnson, a combination of listening to his Chancellor, so power there, and two, thinking he's safe enough to just keep going on the current path, is going to stick with it for the time being.
What do you think, Ian, this is telling us about the internal dynamics of the Conservative Party and indeed the power base of the Prime Minister?
Well, it's certainly a victory for Sunak. I mean, you would have thought that Boris Johnson would be absolutely desperate to go ahead with this, as he is in anything else, because he is entirely desperate to save his own skin. Sunak believed in this. He seems to have held him to the fire. There's a really interesting little detail in the article where it suggests that, well, he said to the Prime Minister, look, there's no way I'm going to be able to cut income tax before the next election unless we have this go through. So actually, when you're sort of looking deeper into the article, it reads more and more like it's Sunak that's calling the shots on this matter, at least. And the fact that they got into a position where they could both put their names to this document would indicate that he is using the advantages which he currently enjoys.
It also, Katy, it points to a pretty big philosophical problem that the Conservative Party needs to deal with, doesn't it? Because on one hand, you need to have sound finances, and on the other hand, you're the party that doesn't raise taxes, but something's going to have to give.
Yes, and the fact that Boris Johnson, at his moment of weakness, after all these party stories, has had the most regular demand be that he needs to axe the tax rise, points to the level of unhappiness, the fact that lots of Tories think, well, this just isn't a Tory policy. I think it's going to be really damaging in the long term. In this article signed by the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, they assert they are Thatcherites, which I think some of their party would be sceptical of at the moment, but they say that's about sound finances. And therefore, I think that, particularly for Rishi Sunak, I think that he is struggling to convince his fellow colleagues right now that he is a low-tax Tory. And that's why there's such an effort to get to a place where you can cut taxes ahead of the next election. Also for the Tories' electoral prospects, given in certain polling Labour is now seen to be more the party of low taxes, which is a strange place to be.
I was going to move us on, Ian, to the back to the front page of the Sunday Telegraph, but there's another article on the front of the Sunday Times there talking about the frat house culture within Number 10 led to the PM himself being banned from taking very highly confidential documents home because the article says that friends of his wife were around and he had them lying around.
Yeah, it reminds you of stories that we saw a couple of weeks ago of people having to erect barriers so that when, Boris Johnson had COVID, he was unable to go sort of hang out with other people. And again, just paints this picture of someone who doesn't have any of the seriousness or the maturity of thought in order to deliver the position of Prime Minister. And it absolutely, I mean, when you see, this is double sourced, when you see this kind of behavior taking place of just top secret documents left open on briefcases with friends of his now wife being given code so they can enter into that flat whenever they like, you think in exactly the same way as you do when you look at the stories of the parties, that this is someone who just doesn't have the seriousness to be occupying that position. This just seems to be one further piece of evidence for what is a pretty unavoidable proposition.
All right, well, plenty more for us to get stuck into after the break. Thank you both very much. We'll be coming back to you again in a few moments. When we come back after the break, the cost of living crisis leaves families on the brink of poverty. We'll be discussing that as it features in the papers. You're watching the press preview with me. Now are Katy Balls, Deputy Political Editor at The Spectator, and Ian Dunt, columnist at the newspaper. We were talking, weren't we, before the break about the national insurance hike, which the Sunday Times says that the PM and Chancellor are agreed on it, that it will be going ahead. And of course, the backdrop to all of this, Ian, is a looming, it's already biting, isn't it, cost of living crisis?
Yeah, exactly. So inflation across the board, particularly in energy prices. And once again, you see a similar situation really as when it comes to foreign policy, which is a government that has done absolutely nothing to help and in several ways has actually conspired to make things considerably worse. The tax rise is obviously a case in point. But you see the same if you look at the way that businesses are treated. I mean, we brought in import controls against the Europeans from the 1st of January. What that means for lots of companies is they have to start suddenly providing the customs checks, the country of origin declarations, the sanitary and phytosanitary declarations. All of that costs a lot of money for companies. The people that get that price passed on to them are the consumers. Exactly the same thing has happened with labour, with rising labour costs as a result of shortages, itself a mixture of COVID and Brexit. So here again, when we start to see the business end of what this entails, I mean, you're seeing the Joseph Rowntree Foundation warning of 2,000 children in Scotland who are at risk of hunger over the winter.
It's 20,000, Ian. It's
I beg your pardon, 20,000.
It's a lot worse than that, yeah.
Quite right. This is the business end of what we're seeing. And once again, we see a government that primarily deals in inaction and indifference. And when it does do something, tends to make the situation worse.
Yeah, it's on the front page of the Sunday Mail, also featuring Katy on the front page of the Observer, and a lot of commentators saying that this is a government that time and time again shows that it doesn't understand how ordinary people live.
I think you can see that theme in terms of the idea of one rule for them and COVID rules. But then, as you say, in a way, I think the bigger problem for this government and Boris Johnson, if he stays in the position, is cost of living. We expect it to get much worse before it gets any better. And in terms of the tools the government has at its disposal, it's not clear what they want to use. We're hearing more about what they don't plan to do than what they do plan to do. So things like, cutting VAT, energy bills, lots of these things being mooted, but we're not there yet in terms of any decisions. And it's an interesting story on the front of the Observer, which is talking about, these buy now, pay later companies. I think Klarna is one of the most famous and tends to be more focused on, electricity products, or these, but now you're seeing some of these other companies targeting those who are clearly vulnerable, saying, you can use us to do your weekly shop. So if we're getting to the point where rising prices mean that all of a sudden even the weekly shop is looking very difficult to do, I think Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson are going to come under more pressure to come up with something sooner rather than later. One of the media was, this idea of one-off payments to the most in need, but again, working out how to reach all those people. So it's very complicated, and I think hard for the government to really effectively do at the moment.
Yeah, all right, both. Thank you very much.